I kept my mother-in-law's secret for 6 long years. It was a promise I made quietly, one I carried like a hidden weight in my chest every single day. I believed that protecting her would protect my husband, that silence was an act of love, and that some truths were too dangerous to reveal. I was wrong. My husband found out, and the first thing he did was slap me. The shock of it is something I will never forget, because in that instant, my world flipped, and everything I had held on to for years came crashing down. My husband had always seemed like the perfect partner. He was charming, attentive, and patient, or so I thought. He loved his mother dearly, and I believed that devotion was what made him the man I married. The mother-in-law, meanwhile, had always been a commanding presence, someone whose influence over the family could not be ignored. She confided in me early in our marriage, revealing a secret so serious that it shook me to my core. I vowed to keep it, believing it would spare my husband heartache and protect the fragile balance of our family. The secret was monumental. It wasn't just a minor deception. It was something that directly affected my husband's life, his finances, and the way he understood his own family. She had been hiding the truth about a financial betrayal that, if revealed, would have upended his sense of trust and security. For 6 years, I kept this knowledge hidden, navigating every family gathering, every conversation, and every interaction with extreme care. Every word I spoke was measured. Every silence was deliberate. I became an expert in concealment, walking a tightrope of loyalty and fear. Living in Texas, the stakes felt even higher. Family loyalty is a sacred value here, and breaking a promise of this magnitude could have consequences far beyond my immediate life. Every holiday, every birthday, every dinner at the mother-in-law's house reminded me of the precarious balance I had to maintain. I smiled when I wanted to warn, nodded when I wanted to protest, and remained silent when I longed to shout. It was exhausting, isolating, and terrifying, but I convinced myself that I was doing the right thing. Then the unthinkable happened. The secret, which I had guarded with my entire being, was discovered, not by me, but by my husband. In an instant, the careful equilibrium I had maintained for 6 years was obliterated. His eyes locked on the truth, and I saw the moment he realized that I had known all along. His rage didn't turn toward his mother first. It turned toward me. The slap was swift, violent, and terrifying. For a moment, my body and mind froze. 6 years of loyalty and careful concealment were met with immediate physical punishment. In one blow, my entire world had shifted from private agony to urgent survival. Before the slap, my life had seemed ordinary on the surface. Friends and neighbors saw a happy marriage, but underneath, I was carrying a secret that could destroy everything. Every day, I reminded myself why I had kept the promise to my mother-in-law. I thought that revealing the truth might hurt my husband temporarily, but I believed that protecting him from the full shock of the secret would ultimately spare him long-term pain. I thought I was helping him, shielding him from devastation, but I couldn't have been more wrong. The mother-in-law's secret wasn't something minor or forgettable. It had consequences that rippled through our entire family life. I had watched my husband make life decisions, plan investments, and trust his mother with his most personal finances, all while a hidden deception loomed behind the scenes. Every moment I spent keeping the secret was a battle between my loyalty to him and my growing fear that this truth might one day destroy him. I had to navigate my own emotions carefully, suppressing frustration, anger, and the deep sense of injustice I felt. I became an expert at maintaining appearances. At family dinners, I laughed at jokes that cut too close to the secret. In conversations about money or inheritance, I deflected, smiled, and changed the subject. At every gathering, I carefully monitored my mother-in-law's behavior and the subtle ways she tried to manipulate the narrative to her advantage. I was constantly on alert, never allowing a slip, never letting a hint escape my lips. The tension became a part of me, and the anxiety of being caught, even unintentionally, followed me everywhere. Texas itself amplified the pressure. In this state, family loyalty is deeply intertwined with personal honor. To reveal such a secret would not just have caused personal pain, it would have fractured family relationships for generations. I felt trapped between two impossible options: continue the secrecy and risk living a life of silent tension, or reveal the truth and watch the man I loved and his family unravel. For 6 years, I chose the first option, believing it to be the act of love and courage. But nothing can stay hidden forever. The day my husband discovered the truth, it all fell apart. A simple mistake, a document left in plain sight, exposed the reality I had worked so hard to conceal. I watched the shock register on his face, the disbelief, the anger, and then the betrayal directed at me. I had protected him for 6 years, and yet in that moment, he saw me as the one responsible. The slap came without warning. The physical pain was sharp, but the emotional devastation cut even deeper. My world, carefully managed for years, shattered in a single instant. In the moments after the slap, I felt a mix of terror, betrayal, and disbelief. I had spent 6 years holding the weight of a secret, only to be punished for the very loyalty that had guided me. The home I thought was safe became a place of danger. Every memory of careful silence now felt like a trap. I realized that my fight was no longer just about keeping a secret. It was about survival, dignity, and reclaiming my life from the chaos that had erupted. For 6 years, I lived with the secret weighing on me every single day. It wasn't something I could casually ignore or shove into the back of my mind. The knowledge I carried was like a shadow that followed me from room to room, affecting how I spoke, how I acted, and even how I thought. I had to carefully choose every word around my husband and the mother-in-law, because one slip, one wrong expression could trigger disaster. I often lay awake at night, thinking about the consequences of revealing the truth. The moral dilemma haunted me. Was it more loving to keep the secret or to finally tell him? I convinced myself over and over that silence was the greater act of love. My mother-in-law was a formidable woman. She was intelligent, controlling, and extremely persuasive. I had grown up in a family where honesty and openness were prized, but in her house, secrecy was currency. When she confided in me, she made it clear that what she was telling me was not for my own benefit, but for my husband's. I felt trapped, knowing the power she held over him and how the revelation could destroy the trust he had in the entire family. Yet at the same time, I hated the burden. I hated having to smile and nod while she manipulated his life, while I silently carried the knowledge of her deception. The secret itself was devastating. It was not something small that could be explained away or forgiven easily. It struck at the very core of my husband's identity, at the foundation of the life he thought he had built. It involved finances that he believed were secure, trust he had placed in his mother without question, and the image of his family as honorable and reliable. The reality was far from that. The mother-in-law had taken advantage of his trust, redirecting assets, hiding evidence, and creating a false narrative for years. I knew that if he ever discovered the truth without preparation, it could destroy him, but keeping it from him was a constant torture. Every day I felt like I was walking a tightrope. Even the simplest interactions could be dangerous. If my husband mentioned family finances, I had to be careful not to give a reaction that might hint at my knowledge. If the mother-in-law brought up a topic related to the secret, I had to appear engaged yet neutral, nodding as though I were oblivious. It was exhausting. I became hyper-aware of small gestures, tone of voice, and timing. I learned to hide my reactions reflexively, developing an almost unnatural composure that only added to the stress I carried inside. Texas, where we lived, only amplified the stakes. Family loyalty and reputation are deeply valued here. A revelation like the one I was hiding could have ripple effects that lasted for years. It was not just about my husband or me. It was about the extended family, friends, and the community we were part of. I felt trapped, like a prisoner in my own home, forced to navigate a minefield of social expectations while holding a secret that could explode at any moment. Every dinner, every holiday, every casual conversation with relatives became a test of control and composure. I convinced myself for years that my silence was the right choice. I told myself that by keeping the secret, I was protecting my husband, preserving his happiness, and maintaining family peace. I believed that once the time was right, or once he was strong enough to handle it, I would reveal the truth in a way that minimized pain. But the longer I held it in, the heavier the weight became. Each day of silence was a day of anxiety, of fear, and of wondering if one slip might trigger the unraveling of everything I had been trying to protect. Then it happened. The moment I had feared. The moment that made every sleepless night and every tense conversation worth remembering in horror. My husband discovered the secret. I did not reveal it. It was a mistake, a carelessness, a document left in plain sight, something small that set off a chain reaction. He saw it, and in an instant he understood everything. He did not just see the truth. He understood that I had known all along. I watched his expression change, the shock giving way to disbelief, then to rage. I had spent 6 years carrying this secret to protect him, and in that moment my loyalty became my crime. The slap was instantaneous and devastating. I felt it before I even registered it. My cheek burned, my head jerked to the side, and for a moment I could not breathe. The physical pain was sharp, but the emotional impact was even worse. 6 years of silent suffering, of carrying the burden of deception to protect the one I loved, was met with sudden, violent punishment. It was terrifying, disorienting, and surreal all at once. The man I trusted, the person who had vowed to protect and cherish me, had just turned his fury on me. In the seconds after, I felt a mix of shock and fear. My instincts told me to retreat, to put space between myself and him. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking, and documented the injury. I sought immediate medical attention to ensure there was proof of what had happened. Every movement, every choice was deliberate, because I knew that what had started as a personal betrayal was about to become a legal and emotional war. The police report, the protective order, and the collection of evidence became the first steps in a battle I had no choice but to fight. Even as I processed the slap, my mind began racing. I knew I had to prepare for what would come next. This was no longer a private secret to be hidden or a family dynamic to be managed. The assault marked the shift from quiet suffering to active survival. I had to defend myself, protect my life, and confront the consequences of 6 years of loyalty that had been met with violence. The weight of the secret, the betrayal of trust, and the sudden need for legal and personal defense combined into a storm that would define the next chapter of my life. Before that fateful day, I often questioned my own decisions. 6 years is a long time to live in secrecy, to weigh every word, every look, every action. I sometimes wondered if keeping the secret was truly helping my husband or simply protecting my mother-in-law. I worried that by staying silent, I was enabling a deception that could ultimately harm him more deeply. Yet each time I considered revealing the truth, I felt paralyzed. I feared the devastation it would cause, the anger it might spark, and the permanent fracture it would create in our family. The mother-in-law was cunning. She had a way of twisting conversations so that the focus always remained on her intentions, on her perspective. Even when I tried to bring up concerns about the financial manipulations or the potential impact on my husband, she would deflect, charm, and redirect the narrative. I learned quickly that any hint of suspicion would be met with subtle intimidation or guilt. She was a master at controlling the narrative, and I became a participant in her careful orchestration. Living under her influence, I became almost invisible in my own life. I avoided confrontation, measured every action, and suppressed my own feelings to maintain the fragilest balance. I celebrated birthdays, holidays, and milestones quietly, always with the knowledge that the truth lurked just beneath the surface. I became exhausted by the constant vigilance. My mind replayed scenarios endlessly. What if he discovered it accidentally? What if the mother-in-law grew careless? What if the secret surfaced in the wrong hands? Each worry compounded the stress, and yet I continued, believing that the loyalty I showed was a form of love. Then the day arrived that I had feared for 6 years. My husband discovered the secret in a way I could never have anticipated. It was a seemingly small oversight, a misplaced paper, a careless mistake by the mother-in-law. But that small act unleashed the full truth. I watched as his face shifted from confusion to realization and then to rage. I saw in his eyes that he knew I had been aware of the deception the entire time. Everything I had done to protect him, to shield him from pain, now became the reason for his anger. The slap changed everything. It was swift and shocking, a physical manifestation of the betrayal he felt. I felt the sting across my cheek, the sudden force that knocked the breath from my lungs. In that instant, years of loyalty, careful concealment, and silent suffering were met with violence. My trust was shattered. My sense of security evaporated. The home I thought was safe became a place of fear. The slap was not just an act of anger. It was a turning point, a signal that everything had changed and that the careful balance I had maintained for so long no longer existed. In the moments after the slap, my thoughts raced. I knew I had to act quickly, not just for my own safety, but to ensure there was a record of what had happened. I documented the injury, sought medical attention immediately, and began the process of filing a police report. Each step was deliberate. Every action was calculated to protect myself legally and emotionally. I had moved from a life of silent vigilance to one of urgent survival, where every decision carried weight and consequence. Even as I focused on safety, I reflected on the complex web of relationships that had led to this moment. My mother-in-law's manipulations, my husband's misplaced rage, and my own years of secrecy had converged into a perfect storm. I realized that my life would never return to the naive sense of security I once had. I had to navigate a new reality, one where trust was broken, violence had intruded, and the family I thought I knew was fractured. Texas, where we had built our life together, felt both familiar and suffocating. The values of loyalty, family honor, and community reputation weighed heavily on me. I had maintained the secret in part because I wanted to protect our family's image, but I now understood that some acts of loyalty could not outweigh the need for safety and truth. The slap was a brutal reminder that the cost of silence can sometimes be higher than the cost of revelation. For years, I felt trapped in a life where my role was to observe and endure. Every day required vigilance. I learned to hide my emotions behind a calm exterior, to smile even when my chest was tight with anxiety. I carefully monitored my husband's moods, my mother-in-law's subtle cues, and the faintest signs that the secret might be uncovered. I became hyper-aware of the small things: a misplaced envelope, a slip of the tongue, a question asked too eagerly. I knew that any one of these moments could unravel the careful balance I maintained, and the fear of that eventuality was constant. The mother-in-law's presence was inescapable. She had a way of making herself central to every decision, every conversation, every family event. Her charisma masked a controlling streak, and I learned quickly that defiance would not be tolerated. When she shared the secret with me, it came with an unspoken demand: protect it no matter what. She insisted that I would be the guardian of a truth so explosive that revealing it could destroy my husband's faith in his own family. I believed her because I trusted her experience, and I loved my husband. But the weight of responsibility pressed down on me relentlessly. Every decision I made in my marriage was colored by the secret. I had to balance honesty with protection, loyalty with discretion. I learned to nod when my husband asked about finances, even when I knew the truth. I smiled through family gatherings while my heart raced with anxiety over what could happen if someone else accidentally revealed the information. I was constantly calculating, anticipating the potential consequences of every interaction, and preparing contingencies in my mind. The burden was exhausting, but I convinced myself it was worth it. Over the years, I began to question my choices. Was keeping the secret truly an act of love, or had I been naive? Had my loyalty blinded me to the fact that some truths, no matter how painful, need to be revealed for the sake of honesty and trust? I replayed scenarios in my mind endlessly, imagining how my husband might react if he discovered the secret prematurely. Each imagined outcome was more terrifying than the last, and still I remained silent, bound by a promise I had made 6 years earlier. Then, without warning, the secret came to light. It was not through confession, not through my choosing, but through a small, careless mistake that neither my husband nor I could control. A single document left, where it shouldn't have been revealed, the hidden truth. I watched in horror as my husband's expression changed. First came confusion, then recognition, and finally rage. His anger was not directed at his mother, who had orchestrated the deception, but at me. He saw that I had known, that I had chosen silence for 6 years, and he interpreted it as betrayal. The slap was sudden, violent, and shocking. I felt it before I registered it fully. My cheek burned, my vision blurred, and my mind struggled to process the immediate physical reality of the act. But the emotional devastation cut even deeper. 6 years of loyalty and silent suffering were met with a violent expression of anger. The trust I had believed in, the safety I had felt in my own home, evaporated in that single moment. I realized then that my world had shifted irreversibly. In the aftermath, I had to think quickly. My first instinct was survival. I retreated from the immediate danger, documented my injuries, and sought medical attention to ensure a formal record existed. Each step was deliberate, calculated to protect myself while laying the groundwork for the legal steps I would soon have to take. Filing a police report and obtaining a protective order became immediate priorities, transforming the situation from private family betrayal to an urgent legal matter. Even as I focused on my safety, I reflected on the complex web of relationships that had led to this moment. The mother-in-law's manipulations, the husband's misplaced fury, and my own silence had converged into a perfect storm. I realized that nothing in my life would ever return to what it had been. The home that had once been a place of comfort now felt like a site of danger and betrayal. The incident forced me to confront the reality that my years of loyalty intended to protect had collided with the violence of someone I trusted most, leaving me to navigate a new world where trust had been shattered. Texas, my home for many years, felt simultaneously familiar and suffocating. Here, family loyalty and reputation are central values, and the revelation of the secret was not just a personal betrayal, it threatened the perception of the entire family. I had maintained my silence to protect my husband and the family's honor, but the slap revealed that some forms of loyalty can come at a personal cost far higher than anticipated. I understood then that my life had entered a new phase, one in which survival, justice, and reclaiming my dignity became the only priorities. The moment the slap landed, I realized my life had changed forever. I had spent 6 years carefully holding a secret, monitoring every word, every glance, every moment, and now all of it had exploded into chaos. My husband's violence made it clear that silence was no longer an option, not for protection, not for loyalty, and certainly not for my safety. The house, once a place of calm routine, became a battlefield where every decision carried consequences. The first hours after the slap were surreal. My body still burned from the impact, and my mind was racing with disbelief and fear. I had to act quickly. My instinct was to document everything. I used my phone to take photos of the injury, carefully noting time and date, making sure nothing could be questioned later. I called my doctor, arranged for an urgent examination, and ensured a full medical report was filed. Every detail mattered, because I knew that the law would become the arena in which I had to fight, not just for justice, but for my safety and sanity. The police report came next. Explaining the situation was difficult. I had to recount 6 years of secrecy, the pressure I had lived under, and the moment of violence, all while controlling my fear. The officer listened, asked precise questions, and documented everything meticulously. I knew this report would become crucial evidence, not just for the immediate assault, but for any future proceedings, including divorce. Filing for a temporary protective order was the next step. I could not risk another moment of violence, and the legal system provided the first real barrier against it. Even as I navigated the immediate crisis, I realized the battle had just begun. This was not just about a single act of violence. It was about 6 years of manipulation, lies, and family betrayal. My mother-in-law had orchestrated a situation in which her secret would dominate every decision and control the narrative. And my husband's rage became a weapon pointed directly at me. I understood then that my fight would need to be twofold. One, to protect myself and hold him accountable for his assault, and two, to expose the truth behind the deception that had shaped our lives for so long. The legal battle for the assault charge became the first layer of this fight. I worked closely with domestic violence advocates to ensure that my rights were protected and that every step was taken carefully. The protective order was enforced, my medical evidence submitted, and every interaction with my husband monitored. Each court date, each meeting with lawyers, each documented report became a thread in a growing web of legal accountability. I was no longer a silent observer. I had to become an active participant in my own defense. At the same time, I knew the divorce had to be approached strategically. The slap alone provided grounds, but it was only part of the story. I needed to show that our marriage had been built on a foundation of deception, manipulation, and hidden truths. My mother-in-law's secret, once revealed in court, would provide critical context. My silence had been an act of loyalty, not deceit, and my husband's violence was the culmination of years of lies and manipulation. Each piece of evidence, each testimony, each document had to be arranged to tell the complete story of 6 years of living under pressure. This was the start of the dance, an alternating rhythm of preparation, anticipation, and confrontation. On one hand, I had to maintain composure, present facts clearly, and uphold my credibility in the eyes of the court. On the other hand, I had to navigate the unpredictable reactions of both my husband and the mother-in-law, whose combined manipulations threatened to undermine every step. Each legal filing, each statement, each piece of evidence was a calculated move in this intricate dance, a balancing act between exposing the truth and defending myself from further attack. The psychological toll was immense. Every interaction with my husband became a test of self-control. Every attempt to communicate or negotiate was filtered through the lens of potential manipulation or provocation. My mother-in-law, emboldened by the initial chaos, attempted to intervene, offering explanations and excuses that distorted reality. I had to resist being drawn into their narrative, holding firm to the facts I could prove, the evidence I had meticulously gathered, and the clear chronology of events that could not be disputed. As the divorce proceedings advanced, I weaponized the truth. The secret I had kept for 6 years, once revealed in the proper legal context, shifted the narrative entirely. It demonstrated that my choices had been guided by loyalty and a desire to protect, not malice or deceit. It also showed that my husband's reaction was extreme, violent, and unjustified, further establishing the grounds for divorce. Each court appearance, each documented instance of violence or manipulation became another step in exposing the layers of deception that had dominated our marriage. I also had to manage the emotional impact. The public nature of legal proceedings, the potential for scrutiny, and the constant reminder of betrayal were exhausting. I sought support from therapists, advocates, and trusted friends who could provide guidance and perspective. Their presence helped me maintain clarity and focus. I had to stay mentally sharp because one misstep could have allowed the manipulation and deceit of my husband and mother-in-law to overshadow the truth. Then came the pivotal moment, the full revelation of the mother-in-law's secret in court filings. I presented every piece of evidence, documented every interaction, and showed how the deception had shaped the years of our marriage. The court saw the full picture, the 6 years of secrecy, my husband's violent response, and the manipulative forces behind the scenes. The secret, once a source of burden, became a tool of justice, turning the power dynamics in my favor. Once I had filed the assault case and started the divorce proceedings, I realized the full scope of the battle ahead. The court process was grueling. Every hearing, every deposition, every exchange of documents forced me to relive the slap, the secrecy, and the manipulation I had endured for 6 years. I had to prepare for every question, anticipate every attempt by my husband and mother-in-law to undermine my credibility, and ensure that each piece of evidence was watertight. It was exhausting and emotionally draining, but I understood that this was the only way to reclaim control of my life. The mother-in-law, of course, did not stay silent. She began intervening in ways both subtle and overt, attempting to cast doubt on my intentions. She wrote letters, spoke to family members, and tried to manipulate mutual acquaintances into defending her narrative. I knew that if I allowed her influence to go unchecked, it could erode the strength of my case. I meticulously documented her interference, noting dates, times, and content of every interaction. Each attempt to manipulate became additional evidence of the toxic environment I had been forced to navigate for years. My husband's strategy was to paint me as overreacting, to make the slap seem like a minor incident blown out of proportion. He tried to claim that my decision to involve the authorities was unjustified, and he attempted to minimize his violent behavior in conversations with mutual friends and even in court filings. I anticipated this, and I responded carefully, relying on the documentation I had meticulously collected. Photographs of my injuries, the medical report, and my notes on prior incidents of emotional manipulation and intimidation. Each piece of evidence reinforced the reality of what had happened and countered his attempts to rewrite the narrative. The divorce itself became a multi-layered struggle. On one hand, I had to prove that the slap constituted domestic violence and justified my legal and protective actions. On the other, I needed to demonstrate that the mother-in-law's secret and the 6 years of secrecy I had maintained had contributed to a marriage built on deception, creating a toxic environment that further supported my case for dissolution. The combination of these elements created a compelling picture of a marriage that was unsafe, manipulative, and untrustworthy. As the proceedings advanced, I began to weaponize the very secret I had carried for 6 years. What had been a source of burden became the keystone of my legal strategy. I included detailed documentation of the mother-in-law's manipulations, records of financial discrepancies, and correspondence that showed deliberate attempts to obscure the truth from my husband. The court was able to see the full pattern: my years of silent vigilance, the husband's eventual violent reaction, and the overarching influence of the mother-in-law. This transformed the narrative from a personal grievance into a legal case grounded in evidence, strategy, and undeniable facts. Emotionally, the process was draining beyond words. Each court date brought the reality of betrayal to the forefront. The act of publicly revealing the mother-in-law's secret felt like both liberation and torment. Friends, family members, and even colleagues became aware of the truth, and while some offered support, others judged or questioned my choices. It was a constant test of resilience. I leaned heavily on professional support, therapists, legal advisors, and domestic violence advocates who guided me through the complex emotional terrain and helped me maintain clarity in the midst of chaos. One of the most challenging aspects was anticipating and countering the psychological tactics employed by my husband and mother-in-law. They tried to intimidate witnesses, challenge documentation, and paint me as the instigator. I had to remain meticulous, verifying each piece of evidence, ensuring that all timelines matched, and confirming that every testimony was supported by physical or documented proof. Each successful defense of my position felt like a small victory, but I knew the war was far from over. The legal dance required precision. In hearings, I presented my case calmly, outlining the 6 years of secrecy, the discovery of the truth, the assault, and the manipulative role of my mother-in-law. Each fact was delivered methodically, without emotion clouding the clarity of the evidence. I learned to anticipate objections, respond to attempts at distortion, and maintain a consistent narrative that could withstand scrutiny. It was a delicate balance between demonstrating vulnerability and showing strength. As the process unfolded, the cumulative impact of the assault and the revelation of the secret began to shift the power dynamic. The court began to see the husband's behavior in context, not as a singular act of anger, but as part of a larger pattern of manipulation, entitlement, and aggression. The mother-in-law's interference and the financial or emotional deception became crucial components of the narrative, demonstrating that the toxic environment I had endured was systemic, not incidental. Finally, the moment arrived to formally submit the mother-in-law's secret as evidence. I laid out the documentation in detail: financial statements, letters, emails, and witness statements, all corroborating the story I had carried in silence for 6 years. The court could see the direct line from deception to betrayal, from secrecy to the violent reaction I endured. What had once been my burden became my strongest legal weapon. The weeks that followed were grueling. Each court appearance felt like stepping into a battlefield. My husband attempted to belittle my claims, portraying me as overly sensitive, exaggerating the incident. and questioning my motives for keeping the secret. He argued that I had deliberately withheld information, trying to turn my loyalty into a weapon against me. I had anticipated this tactic, so I responded carefully. I presented the evidence step by step, showing that my silence had been coerced by the mother-in-law's manipulations, and that the slap was a direct response to 6 years of pressure and secrecy. The mother-in-law's attempts to intervene escalated. She reached out to friends, relatives, and even professionals who had been involved in our lives, trying to sway opinions in her favor. She would offer her version of the story, portraying herself as a victim and me as the instigator. I countered each attempt with meticulous documentation, emails, notes, and witness accounts. I knew that the court valued facts over emotion, and that each careful record I had maintained would outweigh her narratives. Every day felt like a test of endurance. The emotional weight of exposing a family secret, coupled with reliving the slap and all the years of secrecy, was exhausting. I often felt drained and anxious, yet I reminded myself why I was doing this. The assault had been a wake-up call, and the exposure of the mother-in-law's secret was not about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life, proving the truth, and ensuring that I would never again be trapped by manipulation or fear. The court sessions became a dance of careful presentation. My lawyer guided me through each step, coaching me on what to say, how to remain calm under pressure, and when to let the evidence speak for itself. I learned to anticipate my husband's reactions, prepare for objections, and handle unexpected challenges without losing composure. Each successful exchange bolstered my confidence, showing me that the truth, once documented and presented clearly, had power beyond manipulation or intimidation. Witnesses were a critical part of the process. Friends and family members who had seen patterns of manipulation, deceit, or aggression were asked to testify. Each statement needed to be precise, corroborated, and consistent. I worked with them to ensure they understood the context, the timeline, and the importance of their accounts. Their support became invaluable, turning years of silent observation into a network of testimony that reinforced the reality of what I had endured. Financial records also played a key role. The mother-in-law's secret involved manipulation of assets, and exposing these discrepancies provided a concrete demonstration of her influence over both my husband and the household. I presented bank statements, transaction histories, and correspondence that revealed inconsistencies, showing how the deception had shaped our financial reality. The court could now see that the secrecy was not just personal, it had tangible, measurable consequences that affected the stability of our marriage. The emotional complexity of the case was immense. I had to manage my own reactions while presenting evidence of years of manipulation and emotional strain. I could not allow myself to be swayed by anger, shame, or grief. Every word, every gesture, every piece of evidence had to be controlled and purposeful. This was no longer about the immediate aftermath of the slap. It was about demonstrating the long-term pattern of deception, abuse, and control that had governed our lives. As the proceedings advanced, the impact on my husband became clear. His attempts to discredit me faltered under the weight of documentation, witness testimony, and the stark reality of the secret I had carried. The slap, once minimized, was now understood in context as a violent response to prolonged manipulation and concealment. The mother-in-law's role, once hidden, was now undeniable. Her secret, which I had protected for years out of loyalty, became the fulcrum of justice, tipping the balance in my favor. The final submissions were a turning point. I formally presented all evidence, including the medical report from the slap, the documentation of the mother-in-law's manipulations, and the compiled witness statements. The court could now see the full scope: 6 years of secrecy, the pressure it created, the resulting violence, and the necessity of legal intervention. The narrative shifted entirely. I was no longer the silent participant. I was the one who had acted responsibly, documented carefully, and sought justice. As the case progressed, I realized that every small detail could tip the balance in the courtroom. My husband tried repeatedly to minimize his actions, claiming that the slap had been a reaction to stress or provocation, but each of his attempts faltered under the scrutiny of the documented evidence. My medical report, witness statements, and detailed chronology of the mother-in-law's manipulations painted a picture that could not be ignored. The court began to understand that the slap was not an isolated event. It was the inevitable outcome of 6 years of deception, tension, and emotional pressure. Every hearing felt like a high-stakes negotiation, with each participant, the judge, the lawyers, the witnesses, carefully observing my composure. I had to remain calm even as my heart raced with anxiety. I knew that any sign of emotional weakness could be interpreted as dishonesty or exaggeration. The mother-in-law attempted to insert herself into the proceedings again, submitting letters and statements intended to cast doubt on my credibility, but my lawyer systematically dismantled each claim. The court could see that my silence had been a product of coercion and loyalty, not deceit or malice. Financial evidence became a powerful weapon. The mother-in-law's secret involved long-term manipulation of assets that directly affected my husband's finances and our marital stability. I presented transaction histories, bank statements, and corroborating correspondence that exposed the depth of her control. The court could see that the deception had real tangible consequences beyond emotional strain, reinforcing the reality that the marriage had been built on a foundation of lies. Each document added weight to the case, turning years of silent endurance into evidence of systemic manipulation. Witness testimonies were pivotal. Friends, family members, and even professional advisors who had observed the patterns of manipulation were brought forward. Each testimony was carefully corroborated, reinforcing the timeline of events and confirming the existence of the secret. These witnesses provided a bridge between my personal experience and objective reality, allowing the court to see the consistent pattern of deception and abuse over the years. Their statements turned what had once been private suffering into undeniable public fact. Throughout the process, I faced immense emotional strain. Reliving the slap, recounting years of secrecy, and exposing family betrayals was exhausting. I had to compartmentalize my feelings, maintaining focus on the legal strategy while managing grief, anger, and anxiety. Therapy sessions became critical to maintaining my stability. I learned techniques to manage stress, maintain composure under cross-examination, and respond rationally to provocation. Each session strengthened my resilience, allowing me to face the courtroom with clarity and purpose. The mother-in-law escalated her interference. She tried to intimidate witnesses, challenge evidence, and manipulate social narratives outside the courtroom. I countered by meticulously documenting each attempt, creating a clear record of obstruction and manipulation. This documentation further strengthened my case, demonstrating that the environment in which the slap occurred had been toxic and manipulative, making the assault part of a broader pattern of coercion and control rather than an isolated incident. Every court date became a performance of precision and discipline. I presented evidence methodically, responding to objections with clarity, and letting the documentation speak for itself. My husband grew increasingly frustrated as each attempt to discredit me failed. He tried to insert doubt through emotional arguments, but the combination of medical evidence, witness testimony, and financial records left him with no room to maneuver. I realized that the balance of power had shifted. What had once been a situation of fear and vulnerability had become one of control and strategic advantage. Finally, the moment arrived to consolidate the evidence for the final hearings. I presented the mother-in-law's secret, the assault documentation, the witness statements, and the financial records together in a cohesive narrative. The court could now see the full picture. 6 years of silent endurance, a sudden act of violence, and the manipulations that had created the environment for that violence to occur. The narrative was no longer fragmented. It was complete, undeniable, and compelling. At this point, I understood the full weight of the dance I had been performing for years. Each step, every document, every witness statement, every careful response was part of a rhythm that balanced strategy with emotion, evidence with testimony, and loyalty with justice. The process had transformed me from a silent observer into an active participant in my own liberation. I had weaponized truth, transformed fear into evidence, and created a legal framework that could no longer be denied. The final weeks before the last hearings were tense. I spent every day reviewing evidence, speaking with witnesses, and preparing for every possible challenge my husband or mother-in-law could present. The weight of 6 years of secrecy pressed on me, but I reminded myself that each document, each testimony, each carefully recorded interaction was proof of a truth that could no longer be denied. I had to be meticulous, precise, and unwavering. Any mistake could give my husband the leverage to distort the narrative. My husband, sensing the tide turning, became increasingly desperate. He tried new tactics, sending letters that attempted to intimidate me, questioning my credibility to friends, and attempting to influence the witnesses who were scheduled to testify. I anticipated these moves, documenting everything in real time. Each act of interference became additional evidence, strengthening my position by showing a pattern of manipulation, obstruction, and aggression. I was no longer the passive participant in this family drama. I had become the architect of a narrative that would hold in court. Witnesses played a crucial role in the final phase. Friends and family who had observed both the mother-in-law's manipulations and my husband's behavior provided testimony that was clear, consistent, and corroborated by records. Each witness reinforced the timeline: 6 years of secrecy, the moment of revelation, the slap, and the aftermath. Their statements provided context and credibility, turning personal experiences into an irrefutable pattern. It was exhausting for them to relive these moments, but their courage strengthened my case immensely. Financial evidence became equally powerful. The mother-in-law's secret was not just emotional. It had concrete financial consequences that affected the entire household. I presented detailed records of misappropriated funds, altered statements, and unexplained transfers. Each record demonstrated a pattern of deception that had directly contributed to marital tension and ultimately to the violent incident. The court could see clearly that the environment had been deliberately toxic, and my husband's reaction was not a standalone event, but a product of years of manipulation and pressure. Emotionally, the process was grueling. I had to manage fear, shame, and anxiety while maintaining composure in court. Therapy and the support of trusted friends helped me maintain perspective, reminding me that the goal was justice, clarity, and safety, not revenge. I had to stay rational, articulate, and precise. Each hearing required me to relive the slap and the years of secrecy, but I had to do so without allowing the emotions to undermine my credibility. It was a delicate balance, but every moment of preparation reinforced my confidence. The mother-in-law, sensing that her influence was waning, escalated her interventions. She attempted to sway public opinion through mutual acquaintances, sought to discredit witnesses, and tried to question my motivations in court filings. I countered each move by producing meticulously documented evidence, showing a clear timeline, corroborating accounts, and direct links between her actions and the circumstances that led to the slap. The court began to see the full scope of manipulation and realized that the toxic environment was systemic, not incidental. Finally, the day of the decisive hearings arrived. I presented the full package: medical reports of the slap, financial records exposing the mother-in-law's manipulations, witness testimonies confirming both the deception and the domestic violence, and my own detailed chronology of events over 6 years. I spoke calmly, methodically, and clearly, allowing the documentation to speak for itself. The court could now understand not only what had happened, but why it had happened, and how my silence had been a necessary response to a complex web of family deception and abuse. Each piece of evidence was a brick in the foundation of justice. The pattern of manipulation, the violent act, and the revelation of the secret all combined into a narrative that was impossible to ignore. The court could see that my husband's violence was not isolated, that my loyalty had been exploited, and that the mother-in-law's secret had created an unsustainable environment. What had once been my burden had become undeniable proof of systemic dysfunction, abuse, and deception. The final days leading up to the conclusion of the case were a mixture of anxiety and focus. Every moment was consumed with preparation. I reviewed the chronology of events again and again, double-checked witness statements, and ensured that every piece of documentation was properly organized and backed by evidence. The court's attention to detail meant that even minor inconsistencies could be exploited by my husband or his mother. I knew that precision would make the difference between victory and continued struggle. My husband's desperation became more apparent with each passing day. He tried to contact witnesses directly, attempting to sway them or plant doubts. Some of his friends were used to defending him automatically, but the consistent pattern of his behavior over 6 years was undeniable. I worked closely with my lawyer to ensure that any interference was documented and presented to the court. Each attempt to intimidate witnesses or distort facts only reinforced the credibility of my own narrative and highlighted the lengths he was willing to go to avoid accountability. The emotional toll of reliving years of manipulation and deception intensified. I had to recount the slap, the secret, and all the underlying tensions without showing vulnerability that could be misinterpreted. Therapy sessions became essential for emotional grounding. I practiced recounting events calmly, emphasizing facts over emotion, and maintaining control over my narrative. The emotional discipline required was immense, but it allowed me to present a coherent and credible case that the court could trust. Financial evidence was a particularly effective tool. The mother-in-law's secret involved deliberate mismanagement and concealment of assets that had real consequences for our household. I presented detailed bank statements, correspondence, and transaction histories that clearly demonstrated the manipulation. This evidence proved that the secret was not just emotional, it had tangible effects on our lives, contributing to the instability and tension that ultimately led to the slap. The court could see that the situation was systemic, not incidental. Witness testimonies were a turning point. Friends and family who had observed the manipulations and the resulting stress provided consistent, corroborated statements. Their accounts confirmed the timeline and highlighted the broader context of the slap. Each testimony reinforced my credibility and demonstrated that the incident was part of a larger pattern of abuse and manipulation. The court began to understand that the mother-in-law's secret and my husband's violent reaction were interconnected, forming a pattern of dysfunction that had persisted for years. The hearings themselves were intense. My lawyer guided me through each step, ensuring that every response was precise and every question was answered fully. My husband attempted to belittle and discredit me, but the documentation, witness statements, and financial evidence left him little room to maneuver. I realized that the years of careful documentation and emotional discipline were paying off. The court could see the full scope of manipulation and the resulting violence, and it became increasingly clear that justice would favor the truth. Finally, I prepared for the formal presentation of the mother-in-law's secret. After 6 years of carrying the burden alone, I now had the authority and the platform to expose it fully. The secret was revealed not as a weapon of revenge, but as essential evidence demonstrating the foundation of manipulation that had created the environment for the assault. The court saw the connection between the secret, the emotional pressure, and the violent response, and understood that my actions in seeking justice were both reasonable and necessary. The final preparations before the decisive hearings required every ounce of focus. I spent hours reviewing every piece of evidence, making sure that nothing was overlooked. Witness statements were rechecked for consistency, financial records double verified, and my own detailed timeline polished to ensure clarity. I knew that any small mistake could be exploited and that precision would ultimately determine the outcome. The weight of 6 years of secrecy, deception, and emotional strain pressed heavily on me, but it also fueled my determination to see the truth recognized. My husband's attempts to undermine me became increasingly frantic. He tried to contact witnesses directly, attempting to sow doubt or intimidate them into changing their statements. Some acquaintances were unsure of what to do, but the evidence I had compiled was unshakable. Each documented attempt at interference only strengthened my credibility, showing that the hostile behavior and manipulation were ongoing and intentional. Every move he made to shift blame or minimize the slap backfired, reinforcing the court's understanding of the situation. The emotional burden was exhausting. Reliving every detail of the slap, the secret, and the manipulation required immense mental and emotional control. I had to remain calm and precise while recounting events, ensuring that my emotional responses did not undermine the credibility of my testimony. Therapy became a lifeline, helping me manage stress and anxiety while teaching me to project confidence and clarity in the courtroom. Each session reinforced my resilience, allowing me to face the hearings with focus and determination. Financial evidence played a crucial role in demonstrating the broader impact of the mother-in-law's secret. I presented bank statements, emails, and transaction records that clearly showed mismanagement and concealment of funds. This evidence proved that the secret had real consequences for our household and that the environment in which the slap occurred was shaped by systemic manipulation. The court could see that the incident was not isolated, but part of a larger pattern of deceit and control that had persisted for years. Witness testimonies added further weight to my case. Friends, family members, and professionals who had observed the patterns of manipulation confirmed the timeline and provided context for the assault. Each statement reinforced the reality of the secret and the pressures it created, painting a clear picture of how the environment had contributed to the violent incident. These testimonies transformed my personal experience into documented fact, giving the court a comprehensive understanding of the situation. The hearings themselves were intense. My husband attempted to belittle and discredit me, claiming I had exaggerated or misrepresented events. But every objection he raised was countered with documented evidence, witness statements, and financial records. The court could clearly see the pattern: 6 years of secrecy, manipulation, and emotional strain culminating in the slap. My meticulous preparation and the systematic presentation of evidence left little room for doubt, gradually tipping the balance of power in my favor. Finally, it was time to submit the mother-in-law's secret formally. I presented it not as a tool for revenge, but as crucial evidence demonstrating the foundation of manipulation that had created the environment for the assault. The court could see the direct link between the secret, the emotional pressure, and my husband's violent reaction. This revelation contextualized the slap as the culmination of years of coercion and manipulation, not a standalone incident. My years of silent vigilance had transformed into the key to justice, finally giving the court a complete understanding of the dynamics at play. As the decisive hearings approached, every day felt like walking a tightrope. I reviewed the evidence repeatedly, ensuring the timeline of events was flawless. I went over the witness statements, financial records, and the documentation of the slap, making sure nothing was inconsistent. Every detail mattered. I knew that my husband and mother-in-law would try anything to exploit even the smallest error, so preparation became an all-consuming focus. The tension in the household mirrored the courtroom pressure. My husband's frustration grew with each passing day. He sent letters attempting to intimidate me, tried to contact witnesses, and even questioned my credibility to family and friends. I documented every single attempt. Each piece of evidence of his interference strengthened my case, demonstrating a clear pattern of manipulation and hostility. What he intended as intimidation became proof of his behavior, and the court began to see the ongoing toxic environment he and his mother had created. Emotionally, I was exhausted, reliving 6 years of secrecy, recounting the slap, and exposing the manipulation took a toll I could hardly describe. Therapy became a lifeline, helping me manage anxiety, process anger, and maintain composure in court. I practiced recounting events calmly and factually so that my testimony remained precise and credible. The emotional discipline required was immense, but it ensured that my narrative would be understood exactly as it needed to be. Truthful, rational, and undeniable. Financial evidence played a pivotal role in framing the secret's impact. I presented transaction records, emails, and bank statements showing mismanagement and manipulation that the mother-in-law had orchestrated. The court could see that the secret wasn't just emotional. It had tangible consequences that affected the household and directly contributed to the tension leading to the slap. The evidence painted a clear picture. The environment in which the incident occurred was deliberately toxic, and the slap was the inevitable result of years of manipulation and pressure. Witness testimonies became the backbone of the case. Friends, family, and professionals who had observed the patterns of deception provided detailed accounts. They confirmed the timeline and context for the slap, highlighting how the mother-in-law's secret had created an oppressive environment. Each testimony added credibility to my narrative, transforming my personal experience into verifiable fact. The court could see the full scope of manipulation and how it had shaped the dynamics of my marriage. The hearings themselves were intense and exhausting. My husband attempted to diminish the significance of the slap and questioned my motivations. But the combination of documentation, financial evidence, and consistent witness testimonies left him little room to maneuver. The court could see the clear pattern: 6 years of secrecy, ongoing manipulation, and a violent culmination. My careful preparation and systematic presentation of evidence gradually shifted the balance in my favor, turning fear and intimidation into leverage grounded in truth. When the time came to formally submit the mother-in-law's secret, I did so with clarity and precision. This revelation was not about revenge. It was essential evidence showing the foundation of manipulation that had allowed the toxic environment to persist. The court could see the direct link between the secret, the emotional strain, and my husband's violent reaction. My silence over 6 years, once perceived as complicity, was reframed as endurance under coercion, and the truth finally had its chance to emerge fully. The courtroom was tense the day the final decisions were announced. I had spent years gathering evidence, preparing witnesses, and documenting every detail of the abuse and deception. Now everything was on the table, and the weight of those years pressed down on me. But I felt a strange sense of calm. I had done everything possible to ensure the truth would be seen, and the moment of reckoning had arrived. The judge reviewed the evidence meticulously. The medical documentation of the slap, the testimony of friends and family, the financial records revealing the mother-in-law's manipulations, and my detailed timeline all painted a vivid picture. The court could see the pattern clearly: a marriage built on deception, sustained under the pressure of secrecy, and finally fractured by an act of violence that was the culmination of years of coercion and manipulation. My husband's attempts to deflect blame and minimize his actions fell flat against the overwhelming evidence. The mother-in-law sat quietly in the back, her usual air of control gone. She had attempted to manipulate witnesses, obscure financial records, and undermine my credibility, but none of it had worked. The court had seen through the layers of deception. Her power, which had loomed over my marriage for 6 years, was finally exposed for what it was: a destructive force that had endangered the very people she claimed to protect. When the judge delivered the ruling, it was both a legal and emotional victory. The court found in my favor for the assault charge, recognizing the slap as a serious act of domestic violence. The protective order was extended, and my husband's attempts to discredit me were formally rejected. The ruling validated everything I had endured, confirming that my actions in protecting myself and exposing the truth were justified. Simultaneously, the divorce was granted on the grounds of abuse and manipulation. The mother-in-law's secret was formally recognized as a contributing factor to the toxic environment, and my claims of financial and emotional manipulation were upheld. The court acknowledged the years of silent endurance I had endured, reframing my loyalty to the mother-in-law as coerced complicity rather than deceit or malice. The judgment provided both safety and financial security, ensuring that my husband could no longer exert control over me or the life I was reclaiming. Emotionally, the ruling was overwhelming. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with a profound sadness. Years of secrecy, betrayal, and fear had taken their toll. I had lost the marriage I had once believed in, and the mother-in-law's betrayal had fractured family bonds in ways that could never be fully repaired. But despite the pain, I felt a deep sense of liberation. I was free from the manipulation, free from the threat of violence, and free to rebuild my life on my own terms. The final ironic twist came with the recognition of the mother-in-law's secret in the court documents. What I had carried alone for 6 years was now officially acknowledged, turning the source of my suffering into the evidence that secured my freedom. My silence had been an act of love and loyalty, but exposing the truth became an act of self-preservation and justice. The very secret I had protected became the foundation for my liberation. The emotional healing process was long. I sought therapy, rebuilt friendships, and gradually regained trust in my own judgment. I learned to navigate the lingering family tensions with care, recognizing that some relationships might never return to what they once were. But the sense of control over my own life, the validation of my experience, and the security established by the court allowed me to move forward with purpose and strength. Even after the court rulings, the ripple effects of 6 years of secrecy and manipulation were undeniable. Friends and family approached me cautiously, unsure of where their loyalties should lie. Some relatives had long relied on the mother-in-law's version of events and struggled to accept the truth. Others quietly offered support, recognizing the courage it had taken to endure, document, and ultimately expose the betrayal and violence. I realized that while the legal battles were over, rebuilding trust and navigating fractured family and relationships would take much longer. The husband, once so confident and domineering, became a shadow of himself. The public record of the assault and the exposure of the mother-in-law's secret left him with no leverage. His attempts to manipulate or intimidate me had failed completely. The court's judgment not only protected me, but also stripped him of his social power and credibility. The irony was stark. The very lies and manipulations he had relied upon for years had turned into evidence against him. In the days following the rulings, I focused on reclaiming my life. Every action became a conscious effort to assert autonomy and heal from trauma. I changed routines, reinforced boundaries, and surrounded myself with people who prioritized honesty and respect. Therapy continued to play a crucial role, helping me process lingering emotions of fear, betrayal, and grief. I learned to distinguish between guilt over my decisions and responsibility for enduring circumstances created by others' deceit. Rebuilding financial and personal independence was equally important. The court had secured some financial protection, but I still needed to reestablish a sense of stability. I reorganized accounts, reassessed financial plans, and began setting long-term goals for myself and my children. Each step reinforced that the years of secrecy and the slap were part of a past that no longer dictated my future. I could take control of my life again. The mother-in-law's presence in the family effectively ended. The exposure of her secret and manipulation not only undermined her authority, but also shifted the family dynamic. Family members who had once deferred to her influence now approached interactions with caution and skepticism. While the fractures she caused could not be fully repaired, the truth leveled the playing field and allowed me to navigate relationships with clarity and self-respect. Over time, I found moments of reflection that brought both pain and clarity. I acknowledged the grief for what I had lost, the marriage I had hoped would last, the idealized version of family harmony, and the naive trust I had placed in both my husband and mother-in-law. At the same time, I recognized the strength and resilience I had gained. Enduring secrecy, documenting manipulation, and surviving the slap had demanded courage I did not know I possessed. The legal victories and personal empowerment were the culmination of years of silent endurance and deliberate action. As I began to rebuild, I also learned to forgive, not for their sake, but for my own peace. Forgiving my husband or mother-in-law did not mean excusing their actions. It meant releasing the burden of anger that could prevent me from moving forward. Acceptance of reality and a focus on rebuilding became my guiding principles. I made conscious choices to create a life centered on integrity, transparency, and emotional safety. The weeks after the final court rulings were a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. Every day I felt the weight of what had been endured begin to lift, but the echoes of 6 years of secrecy and manipulation lingered. I had won legally, but emotionally the journey was far from over. Simple interactions with family members reminded me of the fractures that had formed over time. Conversations were careful, measured, and sometimes painfully awkward. Some relatives could not reconcile their loyalty to the mother-in-law with the truth now laid bare, while others quietly offered support but still seemed unsure of how to bridge the divide. I realized that part of healing meant creating a safe space for myself and my children. Boundaries were no longer optional. They were necessary. I removed myself from toxic dynamics, limited contact with those who had been complicit, and sought relationships that were based on honesty. I made deliberate choices about what to share and whom to trust, ensuring that the past could not repeat itself in subtle ways. Each step toward autonomy reinforced the sense of freedom I had fought so hard to reclaim. My husband, stripped of control and credibility, became increasingly isolated. His attempts to reconcile with family members failed, and he faced the social consequences of his actions. The slap, once a single moment of rage, now defined his character in the eyes of everyone who knew the full story. His public and legal humiliation was complete, and I watched as the power he once wielded evaporated. The same deception and manipulation he had relied upon for years had been turned against him, leaving him with no leverage and no path to restore the life he had tried to control. Reclaiming financial independence was a crucial part of the recovery process. The court had secured protections, but the practical reality of rebuilding stability required diligence and focus. I reorganized finances, reassessed long-term plans, and created a framework that ensured security and sustainability for myself and my children. Every action reinforced the separation from past manipulation, demonstrating that the life I was building was grounded in integrity, transparency, and control over my own decisions. The mother-in-law's influence in the family was effectively shattered. Her attempts to obscure the truth had failed, and the exposure of her manipulations fundamentally altered the family dynamic. Those who had once deferred to her judgment now approached interactions with skepticism. While some familial fractures were permanent, the exposure of the truth allowed me to navigate relationships with clarity and authority. I no longer had to balance loyalty to her with protection of myself. The path forward was clear, and I could finally act without fear of hidden manipulation. Over time, reflection became both painful and empowering. I mourned the marriage I had once believed in, the illusion of family harmony, and the naive trust I had placed in my husband and mother-in-law. But alongside the grief was recognition of my own resilience. Enduring years of secrecy, manipulation, and the shock of physical violence had demanded a strength I had not known I possessed. The legal victories were not just symbolic. They validated my endurance, judgment, and determination to reclaim my life. Therapy and self-care became integral to the healing process. I confronted feelings of guilt, fear, and anger, learning to process them without being consumed. I learned that forgiveness was not about excusing others' behavior, but about freeing myself from the emotional weight of the past. I focused on rebuilding my life around principles of honesty, safety, and emotional health. Every step toward autonomy, every decision to protect myself and my children reinforced the lessons learned over 6 years of secrecy and struggle. As I slowly rebuilt my life, I began to recognize the depth of transformation. I had gone from a position of silent endurance to one of empowered action. The mother-in-law's secret, once a source of stress and fear, had become a tool for reclaiming autonomy. The slap, once a moment of terror, became a catalyst for asserting boundaries and demanding accountability. The journey was long, painful, and often overwhelming, but it ultimately led to clarity, independence, and the ability to create a life free from manipulation and fear. The months after the final court rulings were a time of both liberation and adjustment. The legal battles had ended, but the emotional consequences of 6 years of secrecy and manipulation lingered. I had to learn how to navigate life without the constant fear of betrayal, and that required both patience and self-discipline. Every interaction with friends, family, and acquaintances became an opportunity to practice new boundaries, and I slowly built a network of people who respected my autonomy and validated my experience. Family gatherings were especially challenging. Relatives who had once relied heavily on the mother-in-law's influence now approached me with caution. Some were hesitant to accept the full scope of what had occurred, struggling to reconcile their loyalty with the undeniable evidence presented in court. Others quietly offered support, acknowledging the courage it had taken to endure the past 6 years and finally expose the truth. Each interaction reminded me that while the legal victory had been decisive, repairing trust and navigating fractured relationships would take time and careful effort. My husband, stripped of his credibility and authority, faced the consequences of his actions in every sphere of his life. His attempts to reconcile with family members were met with skepticism, and he quickly realized that the public and legal exposure of his behavior had permanently altered his position within the family. The slap, once an isolated incident, now defined him in the eyes of those who had previously admired or respected him. Every effort to regain influence failed, and I watched as the power he had wielded for so long dissipated completely. Rebuilding my financial and personal independence became a crucial part of my recovery. The court had secured protections, but I knew that stability required proactive effort. I reorganized my finances, reassessed long-term plans, and created structures that ensured both security and autonomy. Each step was deliberate, designed to reinforce the separation from past manipulation and to establish a foundation for the life I was determined to build for myself and my children. The mother-in-law's influence had effectively ended. The exposure of her secret and manipulations not only undermined her authority, but also shifted the family dynamic entirely. Relatives who had once deferred to her judgment now approached interactions with skepticism and caution. While some fractures in the family were permanent, the exposure of the truth gave me clarity and the ability to navigate relationships on my own terms. I no longer had to balance loyalty to her with protection of myself. The path forward was clear, and I could act without fear of hidden manipulation. Emotionally, I went through cycles of grief, anger, and eventual acceptance. I mourned the marriage I had once believed in, the illusion of family harmony, and the naive trust I had placed in both my husband and mother-in-law. Yet alongside the grief came recognition of my resilience and strength. Enduring years of secrecy, deception, and physical violence had demanded courage I had not realized I possessed. The legal victories were tangible validation of that endurance, demonstrating that my actions to protect myself were justified and necessary. Therapy and self-reflection became critical tools in rebuilding my life. I processed feelings of guilt, fear, and anger, learning to separate responsibility for my own actions from accountability for others' manipulations. I learned that forgiveness was not about excusing anyone's behavior, but about freeing myself from the weight of resentment and allowing space for growth. Every decision, every boundary set, reinforced my commitment to integrity, emotional safety, and the creation of a life centered on autonomy and honesty. Over time, the process of reclaiming my identity and self-worth became empowering. I shifted focus from the past to the possibilities of the future. Every act of self-care, every protective boundary, and every successful navigation of family dynamics reinforced the freedom I had fought so hard to secure. I realized that the mother-in-law's secret and the slap, while traumatic, had inadvertently given me the catalyst to reclaim control over my life and rebuild on a foundation of truth and self-respect. The lessons I learned were profound. I discovered that enduring abuse or manipulation is not weakness, and that exposing the truth, even after years of silence, is an act of courage and self-preservation. The legal victories provided safety. The exposure of deception brought clarity, and the careful rebuilding of personal autonomy allowed me to reclaim my life entirely. I had survived the manipulation, the violence and the secrecy, and emerged stronger, wiser, and fully capable of protecting myself and my children. Even months after the court's decision, the remnants of 6 years of secrecy and manipulation still lingered. Every family gathering became a quiet test of boundaries. I had to carefully navigate conversations, choosing what to share and what to leave unspoken. Some relatives struggled to accept the full scope of what had happened, still loyal to the mother-in-law, or unwilling to confront the truth of the marriage's toxicity. Others quietly offered support, recognizing the strength it took to endure and expose years of deception. These moments reminded me that healing was ongoing and that regaining trust and understanding would take patience. My husband's presence in the family's social sphere had diminished to nearly nothing. The public exposure of his violence and the revelation of the mother-in-law's secret had permanently undermined his influence. Attempts to reconcile or manipulate family members were met with skepticism or outright rejection. He faced both legal consequences and social isolation, learning firsthand that the control he once wielded had vanished. I watched as the carefully constructed image he had maintained for years crumbled entirely. His failure served as a reminder that deception and manipulation ultimately create vulnerability rather than security. I focused intently on rebuilding my personal and financial independence. While the court had provided protections and a secure settlement, I knew that practical, day-to-day management of life would be equally important. I reorganized finances, reevaluated long-term goals, and established structures to protect both myself and my children. Each step reinforced my autonomy and the hard-won separation from the manipulation and abuse that had defined so many years of my life. The process was not easy, but every small success strengthened my confidence and sense of control. The mother-in-law's authority had been permanently shattered. The exposure of her manipulations shifted family dynamics, forcing relatives to reevaluate her influence and approach interactions with new caution. While some familial fractures remained permanent, the truth gave me the clarity and confidence to navigate relationships on my own terms. I no longer had to balance loyalty to her with protection of myself. The path forward was finally mine to define. Emotionally, I cycled through grief, anger, and eventual acceptance. I mourned the marriage I had once believed in, the illusion of family harmony, and the trust I had placed in both my husband and mother-in-law. Yet alongside this grief was the recognition of my own resilience. Surviving years of secrecy, manipulation, and violence had demanded a strength I had not known I possessed. The legal victories validated that endurance, showing that my actions to protect myself and my children were both justified and necessary. Therapy and self-reflection became essential tools for healing. I processed feelings of guilt, fear, and anger, learning to distinguish between personal responsibility and the manipulation of others. I learned that forgiveness was not about excusing behavior, but about freeing myself from lingering resentment. Each decision, boundary, and act of self-care reinforced my commitment to a life rooted in honesty, safety, and emotional well-being. Gradually, I began to reclaim my identity and sense of self. The mother-in-law's secret, once a source of fear and burden, became a symbol of the resilience and strategy that had allowed me to survive. The slap, while traumatic, became a catalyst for asserting boundaries and demanding accountability. The years of secrecy, violence, and legal struggle were transformed into a foundation for autonomy, strength, and the ability to protect myself and my children. I also reflected deeply on the lessons learned. I discovered that endurance under manipulation is not weakness, and that exposing the truth, even after years of silence, is a courageous act of self-preservation. The legal victories provided safety. The exposure of deception brought clarity, and the careful rebuilding of personal and financial autonomy allowed me to reclaim control of my life. I emerged stronger, wiser, and fully capable of creating a life free from manipulation and abuse. Life after the court decisions slowly took on a rhythm of cautious normalcy. Even though the legal battles were behind me, the years of secrecy, manipulation, and sudden violence had left deep emotional scars that could not be erased overnight. Each morning, I reminded myself that safety, clarity, and autonomy were now within reach, but moving forward meant actively creating boundaries and carefully choosing whom to trust. Interactions with family were still delicate. Some relatives avoided certain topics, unsure of where their loyalties should lie. Others approached me with quiet support, offering acknowledgement of the courage it took to endure 6 years of hidden truths and finally confront both the mother-in-law and my husband. The husband, once so confident and controlling, was now largely isolated. The exposure of the mother-in-law's secret and the public documentation of his act of violence left him with no credibility, no authority, and no leverage. Attempts to sway family members or assert influence were met with skepticism, frustration, and in some cases, outright rejection. The slap that had been intended as an act of intimidation had become a permanent mark of his guilt in both legal and social spheres. Every effort he made to reclaim power failed, underscoring the total shift in control from him to me. His isolation was a constant reminder that deception and violence carry consequences that are impossible to avoid indefinitely. Rebuilding my own life required deliberate effort. The court had secured financial protections, but I needed practical strategies to maintain independence. I reorganized finances, planned long-term stability for my children, and implemented safeguards to ensure the past could not repeat itself. Each step was a reaffirmation of autonomy and personal strength, transforming the years of fear and manipulation into a foundation for security. Slowly, I began to feel the empowerment that comes from actively reclaiming control over one's life. The mother-in-law's influence had also been permanently diminished. Her manipulation, once hidden and pervasive, was now fully exposed. Relatives who had deferred to her authority now approached her with caution, and her power over the family was effectively broken. While some fractures within the family were permanent, the truth allowed me to navigate relationships without fear of covert coercion. I no longer had to act as a buffer between her and my own safety. I could make decisions freely, grounded in honesty and self-protection. Emotionally, the journey was complex. I mourned the marriage I had once believed in, the trust that had been shattered, and the family dynamics that could never fully return to their prior state. Yet alongside the grief came recognition of resilience and growth. I had endured 6 years of secrecy, manipulation, and a shocking act of violence. I had documented, confronted, and exposed every layer of deception, ultimately asserting my right to safety and truth. The legal victories were validation of the endurance, intelligence, and moral courage that had carried me through the darkest periods. Therapy became an indispensable tool, helping me process anger, fear, and residual guilt. I learned to distinguish between responsibility for my own decisions and the manipulations of others. Forgiveness was redefined not as excusing wrongdoing, but as freeing myself from the emotional weight of resentment. Every act of self-care, every protective boundary, and every thoughtful choice reinforced the lesson that personal well-being and security must come first, especially after years of living under coercion. As I rebuilt my identity, I realized that the mother-in-law's secret and the slap, while sources of trauma, had ultimately catalyzed my empowerment. Enduring and then exposing deception forced me to confront manipulation, assert boundaries, and reclaim my voice. I discovered strength I had never known and learned to navigate relationships with clarity and confidence. Each decision, from documenting the truth to engaging legal counsel to protecting myself emotionally and financially, was part of a long journey from vulnerability to autonomy. The legal outcomes themselves had deep significance. The assault charge against my husband formally recognized the danger I had endured and validated the protective steps I had taken. The divorce secured both safety and financial independence, ensuring the husband could not regain control. The public acknowledgement of the mother-in-law's secret provided a broader sense of justice, demonstrating that silence, while often framed as loyalty, must sometimes be broken to protect oneself and one's family. The convergence of these victories marked the culmination of years of careful documentation, courageous decision-making, and relentless perseverance. Even now, years later, the impact of these events remains in my daily life. I maintain careful boundaries with family, prioritize transparency in all relationships, and continue to model autonomy and resilience for my children. They have seen the full arc of deception, betrayal, and resolution, learning firsthand the importance of honesty, courage, and self-preservation. The experience has shaped not just my immediate life, but the values and principles I impart to the next generation. Looking back, I understand that my choices, while difficult and fraught with risk, were necessary. Keeping the mother-in-law's secret had been an act of misguided loyalty, the slap an act of unexpected violence, and the exposure of both an act of survival and justice. Every step required courage and the willingness to endure judgment, isolation, and confrontation. Yet through these actions, I reclaimed my life, secured my children's safety, and dismantled the manipulation that had dominated years of our family history. Ultimately, the story is one of transformation. The silence, deception, and violence that had once defined my existence were replaced by truth, autonomy, and resilience. I emerged stronger, wiser, and fully capable of protecting myself and shaping the future. The lessons were harsh, but they were necessary. Endurance alone does not guarantee safety. Secrecy can be corrosive, and exposing the truth, no matter how painful, is often the only path to freedom. Please tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong to keep my mother-in-law's secret for 6 years, file a police report against my husband for the slap, and expose both my husband's violence and the MIL's secret to secure my freedom. Because this decision didn't just end her honeymoon early, it cost her the husband she loved, turned our parents against me, and left our family so fractured that my own children haven't spoken to their cousins in 2 years. And I'm sure she won't be inviting me to her next family event this year.